Vast stretches of farmland became drifting seas of soil, as wind tore away the very ground people relied on. If you value clear, careful stories about place and survival, consider subscribing to follow this journey. By the 1930s, black blizzard clouds swallowed towns, choked engines, and pushed families to the edge of endurance. Watch to learn how a brutal drought, farming choices, and economic pressures collided to create one of America's most devastating environmental and human crises, and what those events teach us about stewardship, policy, and resilience today. Through archival images, survivor voices, and scientific insight, we will trace the causes, the suffering, and the recovery that reshaped the plains. Hook, the sky turned black. If this resonates, please subscribe for more explorations of American environmental history. Vast clouds of wind-driven topsoil swept across the Great Plains, turning noonday light into an unnatural twilight and coating every surface with a fine, choking grit. Photographers and reporters who traveled into the Dust Belt recorded scenes that read like a catalogue of interruption. Shutters sealed against the grit, schoolrooms abandoned as gates filled with drifts, and highways where visibility dropped to almost nothing. One of the most notorious storms, known to contemporaries as Black Sunday on April 14, 1935, offered a stark, concentrated example, a wall of dust so immense that towns were plunged into darkness and trains were forced to slow for safety. Eyewitness accounts read like testimony. Farmers described waking to the sound of the wind and then the silent collapse of normal light as the sky thickened. Children woke coughing from beds powdered with dust. Photographs by documentary photographers show families standing in front of sodden homesteads, faces streaked, clothes roped with dust. In cities far from the plains, sidewalks and cars were found hidden beneath a thin, brown film, evidence that the storms carried topsoil across state lines and reached metropolitan windows. Medical reports from clinics in affected regions documented an increase in respiratory illnesses, often labeled dust pneumonia, which hit the very old and the very young hardest. The visual horror of a sky gone dark was inseparable from its causes. Intensive ploughing of native grasses, along with drought and high winds, left loose topsoil exposed and vulnerable. When the wind came, it did not simply move surface dust, it mobilized the agricultural memory of decades of land use, reworking fields, and burying fences in a matter of hours. Practical responses followed. Teams promoted contour farming, the planting of windbreaks and shelter belts, and the reintroduction of deep-rooted grasses to bind the soil. Federal conservation programs and local farmers experimented with new techniques, learning through trial and error how to hold a landscape together against the power of the wind. On camera and in oral histories the image endures, the sky turning black, people silhouetted against a moving wall of earth, the ordinary rhythm of life interrupted by something elemental. That image shifted public understanding of farming from an assumption of limitless land to a recognition of limits and responsibility. The storms left behind not only sediment in basements and furrowed fields, but also a transformed approach to stewardship, soil no longer an inexhaustible backdrop, but a resource to be conserved. America before the dust. If you appreciate careful storytelling, consider subscribing for more thoughtful historical perspectives. When European settlers moved onto the Great Plains, they found an ocean of grass that held the soil in place, a living carpet of blue grama and buffalo grass whose deep roots bound the loess and prairie topsoil. The terrain looked hospitable to the eye, but it was a fragile balance of semi-arid climate, native vegetation, and seasonal rainfall. Trains and telegraphs had begun to stitch this region into national markets, and policies that encouraged settlement opened the way for families and larger commercial interests to claim and cultivate the land. Local examples show the transformation clearly. Broad expanses once grazed by bison were plowed into fields of winter wheat and corn, and homesteads multiplied across territories from Texas up toward the Dakotas. Mechanization accelerated that change. Steam tractors gave way to gasoline-powered machines, and new plows and harvesters allowed a single operation to break and seed areas that had previously supported only grazing. Large-scale farming operations, sometimes called bonanza farms, used hired labor and modern machinery to plant monocultures across contiguous tracts. In many places, the practice of breaking native sod for continuous cropping removed the prairie's protective thatch and diminished organic matter in the soil. Practices developed for more humid regions were applied without full appreciation of the shortgrass and mixed-grass ecosystems they were replacing. The result was high initial yields, followed by a steady decline in resilience. Economic forces reinforced the physical changes. Credit systems, railroads seeking freight, and rising grain markets encouraged farmers to push the land harder and to expand acreage rather than diversify crops or invest in conservation measures. Examples from county records show loans extended for deeper plows and additional seed, while local extension agents promoted techniques that increased short-term production. At the same time, the absence of widespread contour plowing and terracing, and limited adoption of soil-conserving rotations, left many fields exposed when conditions turned dry. Speculation and optimism combined with technology to alter landscapes in ways that were difficult to reverse. The climate itself remained a limiting factor. The plains experienced marked extremes of wet and dry seasons, and the native grasses had evolved to survive long periods between rains. Once those root systems were severed and organic matter diminished, wind could lift the loosened topsoil into traveling clouds. In some areas, overgrazing by livestock removed another layer of protection, and cultivated fields that lacked living cover became vulnerable to erosion. The stage was set: a transformed landscape, modern machinery, market pressures, and ecological fragility together created a backdrop in which local hardships could become regional catastrophe. Life on the Great Plains. Subscribe to follow carefully researched accounts of the Great Plains, where deep plowing, prolonged drought, and relentless wind reshaped daily life. The land was open and vast, a horizon that defined routine as much as weather did. Families lived on dispersed farms and small towns clustered along rail lines. Each homestead stood as both livelihood and shelter against a landscape that could turn from generous to brutal without warning. Early agricultural practices favored breaking the prairie sod to plant wheat and other cash crops, and that decision set the scene for the hardships that followed. Houses ranged from wooden frame farmhouses to soddies, thick-walled dwellings built from prairie turf when lumber was scarce, simple structures that insulated against cold and sometimes crumbled under the fine, wind-borne dust. Windmills creaked on their towers and pumped water from wells, while barbed wire fences stitched plots together and marked family boundaries. Daily chores centered on soil and livestock, tending horses, mending fences, hauling water, and watching crops inch toward harvest. Women balanced domestic work with farm labor. They churned butter, sewed clothing from worn fabrics, and often took on field work alongside men when labor was short. Dust storms arrived as moving walls of fine soil, swallowing sunlight and smothering daily routines. Kitchens filled with grit. Mothers scrubbed flour-coated shelves repeatedly. Children's hair and eyelashes were streaked with dirt. Respiratory problems increased as families inhaled fine particulates, and a condition known as dust pneumonia could be fatal for the very young and very old. Schoolhouses sometimes closed because of weather, and mail deliveries were delayed for days. Neighbors relied on one another in practical ways, sharing seed, lending machinery, organizing communal threshing where a single machine would travel from farm to farm, and cooperating to repair wind-damaged fences and roofs. As crops failed and income shrank, choices multiplied but options narrowed. Some families stayed and tried soil conservation tactics like planting shelter belts of trees, sowing cover crops, and adjusting plowing methods to reduce erosion. Others sold what they could and joined long road journeys to factory towns or to agricultural valleys farther west. The social fabric was tested. Civic institutions in small towns strained to provide relief. Churches and women's groups organized food and clothing drives, and county agents offered technical advice on better land stewardship. Through it all, everyday life on the plains was defined by a blend of stubborn resourcefulness and quiet endurance, a rhythm of work and repair shaped by seasons, storms, and the stubborn hope that the next season might be kinder. The wheat boom. If you appreciate this kind of history, please consider subscribing for more. Wheat spread across the plains as a cash crop that reshaped both landscape and livelihood. Railroads cut through prairie and made distant markets reachable, while land policies and aggressive promotion encouraged settlers to break the native sod. Farmers moved off the river valleys and into semi-arid grassland, plowing deep to plant vast swaths of winter wheat and spring wheat alike. The crop that thrived on short growing seasons and thin soils was welcomed as an answer to global demand, and prices during the First World War and its aftermath made planting every available acre a rational choice for desperate and hopeful families. Mechanization transformed farming practice and scale. Tractors and self-binding harvesters replaced teams of horses and scythes, allowing a single operation to sow, harvest, and transport far more grain than before. Seed drills and disc plows facilitated faster cultivation. One family could now manage holdings that previously required a whole neighborhood. At the same time, the introduction of hardy varieties, including strains brought by immigrant farmers such as the Mennonite settlers who introduced Turkey red wheat, encouraged planting in marginal climates where native grasses had once been the only crop. Economic incentives and credit systems amplified the rush. Banks and land companies extended loans against expected wheat receipts, and many farmers mortgaged new acquisitions to buy equipment. Short-term profitability trumped long-term soil stewardship. Practices that conserved moisture, contour farming, crop rotation with legumes, leaving stubble to anchor soil, were overlooked in favor of continuous wheat and summer fallow intended to maximize immediate yields. The monoculture sowing eroded the deep-rooted prairie sod that had held topsoil and moisture in place. The consequences were both physical and human. With native grasses gone and the topsoil loosened by repeated plowing, newly tilled fields were vulnerable to wind and drought. Towns that had sprung up as grain collection points swelled and then strained when prices fell and harvests failed. Many households faced foreclosure, while communities confronted dust and declining fertility in fields once thought inexhaustible. The wheat boom, celebrated for its productivity and economic promise, therefore also set the stage for ecological upheaval by replacing a resilient, diverse prairie with vast, exposed swaths of single-crop wheat. Farming mistakes. Subscribe for more historical perspectives. On the high plains, the wholesale conversion of deep-rooted prairie to continuous cropland removed the very anchor that had held wind and rain in check for generations. Farmers, responding to market signals and new machinery, turned vast grasslands into single-crop wheat fields, and that monoculture left soil exposed when the harvest was done. Plows ripped out sod that had developed intricate root networks over centuries, and without that living lattice the topsoil became vulnerable to wind shear. Short-term decisions multiplied the risk. Deep summer tillage and repeated planting of the same crop exhausted soil structure and organic matter, leaving fields with little resilience when drought arrived. Practices such as leaving land fallow to conserve moisture or removing stubble for sale further exposed bare earth for months at a time. At the same time, widespread overgrazing removed protective cover on marginal lands. Cattle and sheep stripped grasses down to the roots, accelerating erosion on slopes and breaks that should never have been put into heavy production. Mechanization and credit changed scale and behavior. Tractors and mechanized plows allowed a single operator to break far more sod than ever before, and lenders encouraged expansion into marginal acreage because higher commodity prices temporarily masked the risks. Tenant farmers, lacking long-term stewardship incentives, often cultivated lands that had little margin for error. Those economic and social pressures, combined with a limited understanding of prairie ecology, produced a landscape that was structurally fragile when the climate shifted. There were also technical missteps in how fields were laid out. Contour tilling and terraces, techniques known to reduce runoff and retain soil, were seldom used across the open plains, and the absence of shelter belts or windbreaks meant nothing slowed the gusts that could lift dust for miles. Soil conservation science existed in rudimentary form, but adoption lagged behind the rush to expand production. Extension services and practical demonstrations were not yet widespread enough to change everyday practice. Clear lessons emerged from those failures. Adopting crop rotations and cover crops rebuilds organic matter and keeps soil anchored. Conservation tillage and no-till systems reduce disturbance and preserve surface residues that break the wind. Planting shelter belts and maintaining permanent pastures on fragile slopes protect soil physically. Finally, aligning economic incentives so that landholders benefit from long-term soil health, through targeted programs, technical assistance, or secure tenure, turns stewardship into a practical choice rather than an elegy after loss. The farming mistakes of that era were not mere ignorance. They were choices made under pressure, shaped by technology, markets, and incomplete knowledge. A sober reckoning with those choices still informs how agricultural landscapes are managed today, and the remedies are as much social and economic as they are technical. The drought begins. If this resonates, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful histories. The drought that set the plains on a collision course with wind and dust began as a slow, stubborn withdrawal of rains across a wide agricultural frontier. Farmers who had broken prairie sod for wheat and corn found spring moisture failing to arrive. The deep, fibrous roots of native grasses that had once held soil in place were gone, replaced by exposed topsoil that was vulnerable to the first strong gusts. What followed was not a single catastrophe but a sequence of failed seasons. Rainfall became erratic and sparser. Hotter stretches of weather baked the ground and reduced seed germination. Fields that in normal years would have greened were left bare or with stunted, dying stalks. In parts of the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles and southern Kansas, the land that had been plowed for a decade now sat vulnerable to wind. Farmers reacted in different ways. Some attempted deeper plowing in hope of finding moisture, others shifted planting dates, and many simply watched as yields collapsed. One storm stands as a stark example. On April 14, 1935, a massive blackening cloud of dust rolled across the plains and into cities hundreds of miles away, turning noon into dusk and coating furniture and faces with grit. That event, later called Black Sunday, was a symptom as much as a flashpoint. It exposed how years of soil exposure and drought could combine to create storms that carried topsoil for vast distances. Short breaths and coughing were common after these storms, particularly among children and the elderly. Livestock suffered as well, with feed buried or suffocated by drifting dust. Practical lessons emerged even as people struggled. The crisis made plain the vulnerability that comes from monoculture, continuous deep tillage, and the removal of native cover. Modern approaches, such as keeping living roots in the ground, planting windbreaks, rotating crops, and adopting reduced or no-till methods, address the precise processes that allowed dust to be mobilized. Early monitoring of soil moisture and diversifying production can mitigate the cascade from one dry year into a multi-year disaster. The drought's beginning was both an environmental event and a social one, a moment when climate variability met human choices, and the consequences were measured in lost harvests, dusty rooms, and decisions to stay or to go. The first dust storms. Across the Great Plains, where deep ploughing had replaced native grasses and the earth lay bare, gale winds began to lift vast curtains of topsoil into the sky. If you find this exploration valuable, please consider subscribing. The first storms arrived as sudden, almost theatrical transformations of daylight into night, and they revealed how fragile the prairie balance had become. Farmers and townsfolk watched with growing alarm as loose dust took on a life of its own, moving in sheets and waves that erased roads, fences, and familiar horizons. Those early storms were not mere dust devils. They were organized, massive airborne flows, dark, moving walls that streamed across counties and into towns. Visibility dropped to a few paces in some places. Streets turned silent under a blanket of brown. Vehicles stalled, engines choked, and the mechanical hum of rural life was muffled by the constant abrasive hiss of driven soil. Photographers and journalists who later captured these moments described scenes that looked like ash-laden twilight, and newspapers carried images of houses blackened from top to bottom. The human and animal toll became apparent almost immediately. Indoor spaces filled despite shut doors and taped windows. Dust sifted into teeth, lungs, and the lining of clothing. Doctors recorded a rise in respiratory distress, a condition later labeled dust pneumonia, and households developed rituals to keep the grit at bay, pressing wet towels to doorways and covering lamps and food. Livestock fared poorly when pastures were buried or when windblown grit fouled water and feed. In towns, deposits of dust laid on porches and in schoolrooms, and people learned to sweep and resweep, only to find more drifting in with the next gust. Meteorological conditions and human land use combined to create storms that traveled beyond farm country. Winds carried fine particles for hundreds of miles, so that cities far from the plains woke to a thin film of red-brown dust on windowsills and automobile hoods. The scale and intensity of those first major black blizzards shocked observers and forced a change in perception. This was not a localized nuisance but a regional catastrophe in the making. Responses were improvisational at first, neighbors helping neighbors, farmers piling sandbags and scattering straw, while the enormity of the problem became clearer with each passing storm. The memory of those first dust storms lingered not only in photographs, but in the altered routines and wary eyes of the people who lived through them. Black Sunday. If you find this account helpful, consider subscribing for more documentary scenes. On April 14, 1935, a wall of wind and dust swept across the southern plains, turning noon into an almost complete darkness that lasted for hours. The storm came from the heart of the cultivated prairie, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles and western Kansas, and it arrived as a moving, choking blanket that swallowed roads, farms, and towns. People later gave that day a name that captured its scale and fury, but the immediate reality was smaller and more intimate. People pressing wet cloths to their faces, women tying flour sacks over their mouths, and children coughing from the fine, abrasive grit that invaded every room. The human details were stark. Winds picked up the exposed topsoil that years of drought and careless ploughing had left vulnerable, lifting it into black blizzards that could cross state lines. Families reported drifts of dust lapping at doorsteps and filling pantries, while livestock collapsed from inhalation or lack of forage. Medical personnel spoke of dust pneumonia, a suffocating condition that seized the lungs of the very young and the very old. In many places, residents sealed windows with tape and packed wet sheets into cracks, trying to keep the dust out as if closing off the storm would make it pass more quickly. The social consequences were immediate and lasting. Whole households packed what they could into trucks and cars, joining long lines of migrants seeking work or refuge elsewhere. Songs, novels, and photographs of the time captured the faces of those who left and those who stayed behind. Local relief groups and national agencies expanded aid and response, and the spectacle of that day shifted public opinion on land stewardship. In the aftermath, federal and local initiatives promoted measures such as planting windbreaks, restoring grasses, and teaching contour farming. These conservation efforts aim to prevent bare soil from being lifted again and to rebuild a shattered rural economy. Today, the images and testimonies from that storm remain a warning and a classroom. Modern soil management practices, cover crops, reduced tillage, and deliberate crop rotations owe part of their urgency to the memory of storms that blackened the plains. The echo of that day persists not just in museums and books but in the policies that grew from a painful recognition. Landscapes can be resilient, but only when human decisions respect the rhythms and limits of the land. Families on the road. Subscribe for more historical stories. Families fleeing the dust bowl left behind plowed-out fields and boarded-up farmhouses, selling what they could and piling the rest into rattling cars and trucks bound for the Pacific coast. Many came from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, and they followed highways like Route 66 in search of work and shelter. The decision to leave was rarely sudden. It was the culmination of failing crops, bank foreclosures, and dust that invaded homes and lungs. Children rode with faces streaked in grime. Parents carried ledgers of debt in their heads. Vehicles became homes on wheels, stuffed with mattresses, a few pieces of furniture, chickens sometimes clucking beneath quilts, and the small reliquary of family photographs. Men and women improvised trailers or towed makeshift wagons, while others traveled in second-hand trucks patched with tin and hope. Dust worked its way through seals and seams and into every corner. Roadside encampments grew up along the way, where families camped for days or weeks while they sought labor, traded for gasoline, or waited for rumors of harvests to turn into reality. Federal relief and relief workers intersected with the migration as the Farm Security Administration and other agencies established migrant labor camps to provide sanitation, medical care, and moral support. Photographers working for these agencies recorded the migrations. Dorothea Langer's portrait of Florence Owens Thompson at a camp near Nipomo became one of the most enduring images of that movement, showing the strain and stoicism of mothers on the road. Short-term community responses also emerged. Churches and local charities set up communal kitchens. Volunteer nurses tended infants with dehydration and respiratory trouble, and migrant children sometimes attended makeshift schools beneath tents or in repurposed buildings. Reception in destination regions was uneven and often hostile. Many Californians feared an influx of poor laborers would depress wages and strain local resources, and the word Okie hardened into a slur applied to anyone arriving in tattered clothes. Agricultural contractors and growers offered low wages and seasonal work, and some counties attempted to discourage settlement through ordinances or informal pressure. Yet within the camps and caravans there were networks of mutual aid. Families pooled money for gas, neighbors watched each other's children during harvest shifts, and women found steady work in canneries and laundries while men did backbreaking picking in fields and orchards. The road taught new forms of cooperation as much as it revealed hardship. Long after the last dust cloud settled, the migrations left a visible imprint. Oral histories and photographs preserved roots and faces. Federal reform and relief efforts were informed by the experience of those on the road, and the image of the traveling family, car-packed, stoic, and ever-moving, entered the national imagination. Many who left never returned to the homesteads they had known. They adapted, rebuilt, and in doing so reshaped American labor and community patterns in subtle, lasting ways. The journey was one of loss and endurance, illness and hunger. If you find this account useful, please consider subscribing. Winds carrying fine particles turned homes into respirators. Dust settled in throats and lungs until people could not breathe freely. Doctors coined the term dust pneumonia to describe a constellation of symptoms that included persistent coughing, chest pain, high fevers, and the slow collapse of respiratory function as airways clogged with grit and microbes. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and community doctors reported long recoveries and recurring infections after storms passed. Respiratory distress was only the most visible consequence. Eyes irritated and inflamed, cuts and abrasions became infected when grit ground into skin, and chronic bronchitis and other long-term lung damage followed many survivors for the rest of their lives. Food scarcity amplified the health crisis. Crop failures and lost livestock meant families shifted to the most economical calories available, often a repetitive, corn-heavy diet lacking in essential nutrients. Nutritional deficiency diseases surfaced among those who ate little else for extended periods. Pellagra, caused by insufficient niacin, presented with diarrhea, skin lesions, and mental confusion in the most severe cases. Malnutrition weakened immune responses, so ordinary infections grew more dangerous and recovery took longer. Photographs from the period show gaunt faces and hollowed cheeks, children with distended bellies, and parents who traded cherished possessions for a single sack of flour or a ration of beans. Mass migration magnified crowding and public health problems when displaced families moved toward agricultural work in neighboring states. Makeshift camps and shantytowns often lacked running water, sanitation, or reliable medical care. Gastrointestinal diseases spread through contaminated water and inadequate waste disposal. Local clinics and hospitals became overwhelmed, prompting relief agencies to set up mobile medical units and temporary dispensaries. Charitable organizations and community soup kitchens provided urgent calories and basic medicines, and some federal and state relief programs established better organized migrant camps with communal kitchens, bathing facilities, and on-site medical staff, offering a partial shield against the worst outbreaks. The human toll included more than acute illness. There were persistent developmental consequences for children who experienced prolonged hunger and repeated infections. Educational disruption and the constant search for work compounded stress, creating a hidden burden of mental and physical hardship that carried into later life. Public health lessons emerged from these tragedies: the need for improved rural healthcare infrastructure, preventive sanitation measures in transient communities, and coordinated relief that combined nourishment with medical care. Those changes did not erase suffering, but they shaped responses to later disasters and left a legacy of attention to the links between environmental degradation, poverty, and health. Government response. Subscribe for more. Federal authorities mobilized an unprecedented array of relief and conservation programs to address soil erosion, crop failure, and mass displacement across the plains. Agencies created or expanded at the federal level brought together emergency relief, work programs, and agricultural policy reform to stop the slide from productive fields into drifting sand. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work on the ground, planting windbreaks and stabilizing gullies. The Soil Conservation Service, guided by the soil scientist Hugh Hammond Bennett, became the technical backbone for new farming practices and outreach. Payments and policy incentives changed how land was used. Programs paid farmers to retire fragile acres and to adopt contour plowing, terracing, strip cropping, and restoration of native grasses. Demonstration plots and extension agents traveled county to county teaching techniques that helped hold soil in place. Local soil conservation districts were established to translate federal guidance into on-the-ground practice, and cost-share arrangements made it possible for cash-strapped families to invest in terraces and windbreaks. At the same time, some measures, such as acreage reduction payments, benefited landowners more than tenants, and displacement of sharecroppers and migrant workers became a painful side effect. Relief and resettlement efforts moved beyond technical fixes. The Resettlement Administration and its successor, the Farm Security Administration, offered low-interest loans, resettlement communities, and improved migrant camps with sanitation, medical care, and schooling. Photographers working for the Farm Security Administration, including Dorothea Langer, recorded the human toll and helped shift public sentiment toward federal intervention. These programs combined emergency housing and income relief with efforts to restore livelihoods, although relocation schemes met with mixed success and resistance from communities tied to their land. The long-term impact was institutional as much as practical. Soil conservation became a permanent element of federal agricultural policy, and the Soil Conservation Service later evolved into a broader conservation agency that continued to promote watershed planning, research, and technical assistance. Large-scale shelterbelt plantings, improved extension networks, and a new body of conservation law and local governance reshaped the relationship between farmers and the federal government. The response did not erase suffering, but it built the frameworks that would prevent a repeat on the same scale, and it left a legacy of science-driven stewardship across the plains. Lessons learned. Subscribe for more thoughtful historical perspectives on environmental crises. Vast regions of the southern plains taught a stark lesson about the limits of extraction and the vulnerability of soil as a resource. Farmers learned that when native grasses are removed and deep-rooted systems replaced by continuous monocultures, the land stops buffering climatic extremes. In response, techniques that once seemed technical or optional became central. Contour plowing to follow the lay of the land, strip cropping to break wind flow across fields, and systematic crop rotation to keep organic matter in the soil. Extension agents and scientists work side by side with local communities to promote these methods, and federal conservation programs were established to support adoption and to fund demonstration projects. Practical examples changed everyday farm decision-making. Shelter belts, rows of trees planted as windbreaks, reduced wind speed and trapped drifting soil along field edges. Cover crops and residue management kept the surface anchored during dry spells. Reduced tillage approaches minimized disturbance and helped preserve the fragile topsoil that had taken generations to build. These were not theoretical ideas. Farmers who adopted such practices often stabilized yields and reduced the catastrophic loss of productive land. At the landscape scale, restoring native prairie patches proved effective in slowing erosion and providing drought resilience. Social and policy lessons were equally important. The crisis revealed that private decisions have collective consequences, and that coordinated public action can both mitigate harm and provide relief. Programs that combined technical assistance, financial incentives, and educational outreach created pathways for struggling families to transition toward more sustainable practices. Migration patterns underscored the human cost of ecological collapse, reminding policymakers that environmental management and social welfare must be integrated. Research institutions and extension services expanded their remit, embedding soil science and conservation into rural planning. The relevance of those lessons is immediate today. Modern challenges, longer dry spells, more erratic precipitation, and intensified land use, make the old lessons timely once again. Practices born of that episode now sit alongside new tools: soil moisture sensors, satellite monitoring, and precision planting that tailor inputs to real conditions. Conservation easements, prairie restoration projects, and payments for ecosystem services reflect a broader understanding that preserving soil and native vegetation is an investment in long-term productivity. The core truth remains simple and stark: resilience requires humility toward natural systems, continuous stewardship, and policies that align individual incentives with collective survival. Ultimately, the enduring legacy is not only technological, it is cultural. Communities learn to value long-term soil health over short-term gain, to listen to scientific advice, and to insist that land use decisions account for ecological limits. These are practical, applicable lessons for anyone managing land today: farmers, planners, and citizens alike. Sound stewardship, backed by cooperative institutions and informed by science, can prevent a recurrence of past mistakes and sustain landscapes for future generations. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to follow more cinematic explorations of our past. We looked at how relentless drought and aggressive plowing of native prairie loosened the land's skin, how wind turned that freed soil into storms that blackened the sky and carried whole communities toward uncertainty. We traced the human cost: displaced families, shuttered towns, and migrations that reshaped the nation, and the response that followed: federal relief, new conservation science, and a shift in how Americans steward their fields. The Dust Bowl was not just an environmental disaster, it was a lesson in connection between people, policy, and the very ground beneath our feet. If the lives and choices you met here stayed with you, share which moments surprised or moved you in the comments. Like and share to help this history reach others, and subscribe gently if you want more thoughtful stories. In coming episodes, we will examine the science of soil recovery, the resilience of farming communities, and the parallels between past drought and the climate challenges we face today. For now, listen for the distant wind and remember that the lessons of the dust are still ours to learn.